Today's subject will be a condensed version of the rise and fall of the Egyptian Empire. Ancient Egypt became an area of colonization around the same era as our last lesson on Mesopotamia, around 3000 BC, and it ended in the same way, by the same conqueror, Alexander the Great of Greece. An educated guess about how the valley of the Nile became populated stems from the data that explorers from the continent of modern-day Africa settled here around 6000 BC after the last ice age. The area was then a savanna with surrounding areas bordering on forest-sized groupings of trees. Over a period of 1,000 years, the Naqada culture developed from a few small farming communities into a powerful civilization whose leaders were in complete control of the people and resources of the Nile Valley. They traded regularly with the Sumerians in the Mesopotamian Valley and ventured further east into modern-day India. Egypt grew in population, power, and influence at the same time and in the same way as the Sumerians. And frankly, so did everyone who traded with them. Ideas about urban centers and ruling classes were shared by merchants with every great civilization of the time. I could spend all lesson telling you about the Egyptian culture and their contributions to the advancement of the human experience through art, astronomy, politics, etc., etc., because there is so much information available. 85% of the wall surface of every structure was covered in pictograms, hieroglyphs, bas-relief carvings, etc., etc., telling us everything from the everyday mundane life events to the extraordinary deeds of pharaohs and wise men. Until this century, 80% of it was preserved, being buried under tons of sand or underground, protected by worked stone passageways, which were also buried under tons of sand. Curse breakers and obliviators worked closely with Mughal archaeologists to uncover and document these tombs. 82% of our ancient Egyptian knowledge comes from these buried vaults. So let us focus on magic. Remember how I spoke of the separation between us and them in our last lesson? Now I shall introduce the priest class. In the early decades of their development, both the Sumerians and the Egyptians used magic in much the same way. However, marked differences arose when the priesthood class rose in power in Egyptian culture. The people believed that humans possessed a ka, or life force. This force was a free-floating energy in the cosmos, which became attached to a body at birth and left the body at death. The word magic in Egyptian is Heka, but was also the name of a god. So be careful when using the word. Heka was a natural phenomenon, like the sun or the rain, and as such was believed to be the force that created the universe. Gods could use it, so humans could too. By extension, this means you. My research shows that even then, language was closely linked with working magic, or Heka, to such a degree that Thoth, the god of writing, was sometimes said to be the inventor of Heka. Therefore, magic frequently involved written or spoken incantations, although a great percentage of these were accompanied by ritual actions. Often, these rituals invoked the power of an appropriate deity to perform the desired action, using the power of Heka to compel them to act. Sometimes this entailed casting the petitioner or subject of a ritual in the role of a character in mythology, thus inducing the god to act towards that person as it had in the myth. And sometimes it was just the power of the practitioner who wielded magic and manipulated the energy forces and material components to a desired effect. The keepers of the secrets of Ka and Heka were the priests of the temples, effectively taking control of magic away from the populace and making themselves the experts. They would demonstrate their power over magic during regular rituals, festivals, celebrations, etc., etc. One of those rituals, which was practiced at 95% of temples, was the sunrise ceremony. The priests would drape a statue of the god in fine cloth, exquisitely wrought ornamentations, and then the people would present offerings of foods onto the altar while saying prayers or chanting Heka phrases. The priests would let the offering sit until the god had emptied their essence of all of their ritual, spiritual energy. Then systematically undress the statue, disperse the crowd, then take the offerings to their private area and eat them. The temple priests were also the authority you would have to go to for magic bracelets, amulets, potions, curse tablets and dolls, scrolls of binding magic, etc., etc., all for a small fee, of course. Sanctioned practitioners of magic exploited symbolic words, images, and rituals to achieve desired outcomes through seemingly supernatural means. Using magical arts, they attempted to control supernatural powers, gods, demons, spirits, or ghosts, etc., to accomplish something beyond the scope of human capabilities. I will now explain these items separately. Bracelets were long metal plates, thinly hammered and inscribed with phrases of power, then rolled into a tube and bent around the wrist of the buyer. These commonly had the intention of control over a certain situation or person. Sometimes for protection, sometimes for more nefarious purposes. Amulets were similar, except they were more expensive pieces of jewelry, usually fashioned in the shape of gods, animals, or flora, and inscribed on the back. Take the train to the British Museum in London. You can see some of these for yourself. However, it is folly to try to cast the spells by reading the inscriptions. You would need to know the proper pronunciation in addition to the intent of the maker or the buyer. Your charms professor will give you the same warning. Do not try it. Do not do it. Curse tablets and curse dolls had the same purpose: to wish ill will to a person or situation. All surviving tablets were made of lead or stone, and 96% of dolls were made of wax or clay, formed and shaped into the person you wanted to affect. When the doll nowadays, called an effigy, a fetish, or a poppet, had served its purpose, it was easily destroyed, leaving no evidence tied to the person who instigated the omen. Tablets were typically used to influence the outcomes of events. When you made a bet on a sporting event, after the event was over, you would just throw your tablet down a well, which is where the bulk of these items were discovered. Large caches of amulets and bracelets were buried with their owners. You will be amazed at how much ancient history recording relies on trash. Moving on. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, procedures for religious rituals were written on papyri, which were used as instructions for those performing the ritual. These ritual texts were kept in the temple libraries, which, in turn, were protected by powerful protective and defensive spells. Temples themselves were also inscribed with such texts. 76% of the time, they were accompanied by illustrations. Unlike the ritual papyri, these inscriptions were not intended as instructions, but were meant to symbolically perpetuate the rituals, even if, in reality, people ceased to perform them. Magical texts, likewise, describe rituals, although these rituals were part of the spells used for specific goals in everyday life. Despite their mundane purpose, approximately 98% of these texts also originated in temple libraries and later became disseminated amongst the general populace. The Egyptians also used oracles to ask the gods for knowledge or guidance, whom, unbeknownst to the hierarchy, were proficient in legitimacy and divination. Egyptian oracles are known mainly from the New Kingdom and afterwards, though my research shows that they appear much earlier. People of all classes, including the king, asked questions of oracles, and especially in the late New Kingdom, their answers could be used to settle legal disputes or inform royal decisions. A common means of consulting an oracle was to pose a question to the divine image while it was being carried in a festival procession and interpret an answer from the bark's movements. Other methods included highly decorated cards, interpreting the behavior of cult animals, drawing lots, consulting statues through which a priest apparently spoke, etc., etc. The means of discerning the God's will gave great influence to the priests who spoke and interpreted the God's message. Magic was intricately linked with the priesthood because temple libraries contained numerous magical texts. Great magical knowledge was ascribed to the lector priests who studied these texts. These priests also worked outside their temples, hiring out their magical services to laymen. Other professions also commonly employed magic as part of their work, including doctors, scorpion charmers, makers of magical trinkets, etc., etc. Once again, this was the way magic was separated from the bulk of the populace and controlled by the few. The peasantry used simple magic for their own purposes. This magical knowledge would have been passed down orally and genetically, one generation to the next. There are still a few wizarding families who can trace their heritage back thousands of years to the time of the pharaohs. Rituals performed in the home also employed sympathetic magic, using objects believed to have a magically significant resemblance to the subject of the rite. These could range in effect, such as protecting a young child from danger, or finding a lost person. Numerous spells of protection were written on the walls of a house and performed on a daily basis during mundane chores, such as when leaving the house, one would recite the text by the door before leaving to ensure the doorway barrier curses any unwanted intruder. Know this: sympathetic magic employs one of two laws of magic principle called the law of similarity and the law of contact or contagion. Similarity infers that no one can produce any effect they desire merely by imitating it. Contact or contagion infers that whatever the wizard does to a material object will affect equally the person with whom the object was once in contact, with even a stronger effect if that object was once part of the person, such as hair or skin. For further instruction in this area, you can take an extracurricular course in your 6th year. You will also need the book Magical Theory, written by Added Albert Waffling. If you are interested in a career in curse breaking or I recommend this class. More on this later. To summarize, the ancient Egyptian culture primarily developed the necromantic branch of magic. That is to say, magic that involves life and death, or more accurately, the healing and damaging of the human body. Necromancy has taken on the mantle of a malevolent, nefarious art these days, and if used improperly, it is an easy connection to make, but ultimately, it has done more good than harm. If you wish to study this branch of magic, look no further than Madame Pomfrey in the hospital annex. She appoints an apprentice from time to time, if she finds you worthy. Good luck. Moving on. I would be remiss in my duties if I did not at least try to tell you the facts of Moses of Egypt. There are countless conflicting accounts of him, and 0 of them are considered eyewitness accounts, or accurate, or even possible. The waters around his existence are muddier than the Nile itself. Last week, I told you about the integrity of the story writers. This is the story that is victim of that situation. The accounts of Moses are in the thousands, varied, spread across hundreds of years, and a few different civilizations. It's easy to say the Moses figure evolved from these stories. But for argument's sake, let's say there is at least one writer that wrote the true eyewitness story. Who is it? Which one of the 1,000 ambiguous authors? How do we tell? What and where are the facts? My research into the subject revealed these limited facts. Egyptian accounts for a hero who rose to power and freed a bunch of slaves simply does not exist, as far as we know. So far. We have extensive records that show the achievements of pharaohs in the time frame of the Moses legend. It could be that any story of Moses from the Egyptian point of view was a blight on the pharaoh's record, and so not recorded. Again, motivation and influence of the ruling class affects the integrity of the historian. It could be that Moses was written about, but the records were found or destroyed, and all that remained were the word-of-mouth stories. Speculation, conjecture, supposition, etc. We could theorize possible scenarios for weeks. It is impossible to know for sure. Modern religious scholars have argued about the realities of Moses for hundreds of years. They have combed through sacred writings from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the libraries of antiquities, and the hard facts that museums have to offer. None of them have a consensus on who is the true Moses. Ultimately, the story of Moses is a religious one, and as such, is planted firmly in the realm of belief. For religious stories, one does not need proof, only the faith that the story is teaching you important lessons about how the world works. Believe it or not. Moving on. As magic-wielding people, it is easy for us to imagine a very powerful wizard with a stick of wood performing all sorts of wondrous deeds or miracles in the name of what is right. And if you were a Jew, Israelite, Hebrew, son of David, etc., or even just an enemy of the Egyptians, he did it in the name of justice. If he was a wizard who got mixed up in a holy war, he did a good job of it. As I said before, magic was part of the way of everyday life back then. No one thought of a difference between what was magic and what was divine. Historically speaking, 98.5% of the time, they were both the same. Now, moving on. Pancrates and Eucrates, Camwaset and Meridia, died Senefru. All of these and more Egyptian wizards and witches who practiced, wrote, and passed on their magic knowledge and DNA to the next generation. We are eternally grateful to them. The end of the Egyptian Empire fell to the same fate and for the same reasons as the Sumerians. Alexander the Great of Greece, a culture we will cover later this year. It's one of my better lectures, if I do say so myself. This is where we leave off today. Next week, we will be discussing magic of the South American continent. Your preparatory work is to read Practical Egyptian Magic by Murray Hope. Ask Madam Pince if you need help finding it. You will not be tested on it. It's only for psychological reference.